welcome to Southern Fried Asian. I am Keith Chow. I am joined by an awesome guest for this episode. She is the Senior Vice President of Equity and Inclusion for Warner Brothers Discovery. And I'm so excited to have her on this podcast because she's also a native of Pikeville, Kentucky. Please welcome to the pod, Samata Narra.
Oh, thanks, Keith. This is awesome. I'm so excited to be here. I'm a fan of your podcast, but also just what you're exploring here is, I know identity is a really interesting thing, and especially when you've grown up in the South. So I'm really excited to be here with you.
100%. And I'm glad you're here because I think what you're doing at Warner is very exciting. So before we get into your background as a Kentuckian, I did want to give you some time to talk about this new initiative that you launched at Warner Brothers Discovery about basically centering people of color, centering marginalized communities in the content that they produce. So can you talk about what this whole initiative is and your role in it?
Yeah, I would say I don't love using the word initiative. What we are doing here is really thinking about the company as a whole and how it was built. And I think that's the exciting part about this, because the way that we came into it, and I started, and I can just step back a little bit, I started during the pandemic.
Yeah.
So I started April 6th, 2020.
Like literally beginnings of the pandemic.
Yeah. And obviously lots of ups and downs personally, professionally, all the things that could have possibly happened over the last 2 years has been, really interesting thing to navigate while also being in this job. But, I originally set out and came to this organization, one, because of the content. The content offering is incredible. And for someone like me that grew up on a lot of it when it comes to Looney Tunes, DC Comics, but then also I think about what's informed, the last 25 years, 30 years is like award-winning content from, Warner Brothers Pictures and, HBO and HBO Max now. It's been really, really, really exciting, right?
You can tell from my background that I have no connection to Warner Brothers, so I'm glad that
I was literally going to say, but and as you know, as I can see your background here with your Batman poster and the Batman, obviously, the fact that I actually get to go around saying I work at this company and say, we just have the Batman, whatever, like it's cool,
right.
is always a fun thing for me. I have such pride in what we put out, but that's why I came, right? Is the ability to take this like amount of incredible content and understand what impact you can have through storytelling, because superheroes reach my little cousin in India. Like that's the exciting thing. I get to talk to my little cousins and connect with them on the same thing. It's their biggest export, right? Like from the US. And that landscape has changed so much that a lot of the way that we're coming at this work of equity and inclusion is thinking about it on a global level, because, I would say that the last 2 years, it has just illuminated, right? Yeah. A lot of things that a lot of people have been saying. I'm not the first person to take a role in equity and inclusion. It's been around forever. People have been doing this work forever. I think the entertainment industry specifically is paying more attention than ever before. And this is the time where we take this moment and create a movement. And that's the thing I came here to do, which is how do you build like impactful change and accountability and measurement? It's not just about a one-off checking the box thing. It's how do you truly, truly, truly create systemic change, measurement, accountability, but more importantly, unlocking stories that have never been told before.
Yeah.
There's so many stories.
This is, something at the Nerds of Color we've been doing for many years too as well. And it's this notion that like, on the surface, a lot of people probably assume like, well, why do you care about like pop culture? It's trivial. But like, to your point, it's our number one export as Americans, right? Popular culture. And the stories that we see on screen, the stories that we tell ourselves absolutely impact how we see ourselves as people, right? And for generations, if all you see is white, straight, cis people, you're going to think, well, that's the default. That's normal. And everything else is just like, spice. But what we're trying to say is like, what? Brown people, black people, queer people are people. And they have stories too. They're not just kind of like fringe.
Think about the things that bring us all together in terms of inequities, right? I hate using that as bringing people together with regards to inequities, but because you grew up in Virginia, what you see there is very different than living right in a specific town in Los Angeles, right? Like I would say that if you go out to say Palmdale or Lancaster, it's not too different than how we grew up.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea of, growing up in the South is one thing, but there's a lot of inequities and things that bring us all together. And I'm always talking about socioeconomic disparity. But then when you think about it in terms of the intersectionality with race, is like, oh, well, what you find is that because the systems weren't built for us by us, and there's been 400 years then what you think about the entertainment industry, it's 100 years. And then what you're trying to just do is just like, hey, how do you build it so that it evolves with the way the world is changing? And I think that's what is the exciting thing about being where we are in the world, and where, the silver lining, there's obviously so much terrible stuff going on, but how do you kind of try to use these moments and not repeat history? Because I find, much like the rest of the world, but like even with the entertainment industry, it's like there's some repeat history of like mistakes. And isn't that like the definition of insanity, when you're just letting the same thing go over and over again?
And we're definitely in a moment, right, where because there is such a light shined on the lack of representation over the last few years, that we have seen more stories, we have seen more, diverse casting, diverse people behind the scenes getting their chance to shine, and Warner's kind of at the forefront of a lot of that with. You have folks like Issa Rae, and Abbott Elementary is a Warner Brothers production that's like killing it. So like, what kinds of tools have you helped implement over the last couple of years to make sure that Warner is continuing to be at the forefront of that diversity inclusion push?
My team is really, really focused on how do we help, first and foremost, the existing content that we have and what's going out the door. Because it's really, that's where you can change systems the most, is like things that are new, right? Things that are coming out, instead of harping too much on the past. Because much like all art is a reflection of the time that it's in and the person that created it. And how do we, in this next iteration or the next generation, or what I like to say is the next 100 years of Warner Brothers and the next 100 years of this company, build it in a way that allows us to support storytellers in a way that helps them understand the intentional and unintentional impact of their storytelling on the audience. Because I think we're at an inflection point in terms of it not being Hollywood anymore. It's truly the entertainment industry. Mm-hmm. You have more productions happening in other countries than you do here in the United States. And we said earlier that this was the biggest export. Well, now it's becoming...
Yeah. The rest of the world's catching up, if not already lapping us in some things.
Yeah, when I think about Bahubali and the pride that my parents were like, Bahubali is the best movie ever. And if it wasn't for Netflix, like, I think not everybody would know that, right? And I think there's these opportunities right now, especially when you think about the IP that we have, to deliver things responsibly in other languages. And again, it's the greatest IP in the world, in my opinion. So again, I'm biased, so but that's also where I look at the opportunity with like having, Discovery come in and acquire us, right? Is that they're in so many countries. So many languages, and there's some places where there's just such an incredible opportunity where you think about delivering content to the rest of the world. And I think about, again, my cousins that get educated off of Discovery, content, right? And I had the opportunity to work at Fox early in my career, and they have Hotstar. So for me, I've always thought about it in terms of not just what's the impact that I can have on the domestic audience. Yes, I worked at Fox, which is what if you think about the bread and butter, that's like, how do I get content to reach the US, right? That's your objective. Right. But when you think about a studio objective, the studio objective is to get it out to the rest of the world.
And then streaming has even exacerbated that even more, because now you can get that content at your fingertips, and it's a lot easier to get. You have to fill your content because streaming, there's just so many options, right? So where are you pulling that? And that's why things like, it's not a Warner thing, but things like Squid Game become these massive cultural touchstones, even though like not a lick of the show is in English, and that's the future of I think entertainment too.
Well, I think that there's a lot of little known heroes sitting on the ground in so many countries with HBO and across the countries. You haven't even seen some of the cool content that is coming out. Like the quality of local language content that we're making is that of HBO quality because it's still HBO.
Right.
And that's the thing that excited me. I was like, things like The Beforeigners, those are things that I get so excited about because you're seeing it in local language, but when it translates, it's still really, really good.
You mentioned being at an inflection point, and one other thing that's a little bit more controversial is that we are also at an inflection point in this country where we're having politicians kind of like putting entertainment companies in the crosshairs, and anyone really. It's not just entertainment companies, but like what happened in 2020 kind of fueled this push for more inclusion and equity, and what rightfully so. Like, as you said, we've been saying this for years, and it's finally nice to see people catching up to where we've been. But now there's the backlash to the backlash, and you're seeing states passing laws and, you know, targeting corporations who don't toe the, you know, right-wing line. Like, how do you, as the senior vice president of equity and inclusion, like, do you feel targeted by like politicians? Is that something that you're worried about? Like, how do we continue to continue making this progress with having all of this kind of like, you know, BS being blown our way from bad faith actors, let's say?
So that's loaded. That's two different questions in my opinion. So there's the BS actors and then there's the politics.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, sometimes they're the same, but yeah.
Yeah. I would say there's, I don't know how to best answer that, but let me start with the politics side of it. I would say it's not about the politics. It's about what are the shared values that anybody can come around, right? Which is where I kind of started with socioeconomic, and we talked a little bit about that. But when I think about how we can partner, is like if we understand the inequities that are happening or what all these different communities are experiencing, there's an opportunity for partnership there instead of thinking about it as like, oh, the BS that's coming at you or any of that. Because I'm so obsessed with education and the inequities in the educational system and probably the exacerbated inequities that are going to be happening over the next couple of years, is that because I've spent so much time thinking about that, I also think about, oh, well, that's politics. That's a good of like how you can like partner with policy change and people. And I will say, I mean, when people come at us, I always ask the question is like, why? What's the root cause of why you're coming at us? And how do we get to where the solutions are? And oftentimes what they're yelling at us about, if you will, is actually not the thing they're really yelling at us about. So I can give you a really simple example if that's helpful, which is that we need to have more people of color below the line. And the unions, the way that they work is that they have rosters. And so the goal should be to get more people into the union so that they can work. So what policymakers can do is help us change those rules, right? And I think that's where so you can't come at the studio for something that's systemic to a union, right? And so I think if people can just really collaborate and really understand that there's tons of opportunity, especially with the amount of content that's being made versus, 10 years ago or 15 years ago or 20 years ago, there's so much opportunity. So I think that's where I think about from the politics standpoint. I don't know if that answers your question.
No,
but
I mean, that's actually a great answer because it's solutions focused. And I think too often we get caught up in the outrage and the emotion and we forget about the solution. And like, that's what I'm saying. Like what's happening in Florida, like literally trying to cancel an entertainment company because of, they support the right of gay people to exist. It's wild. But I think to your point, we should be more solutions focused. And how can we work together? Because at the end of the day, like we started this conversation about, like, the reason we want to tell these stories, it's not because, we're trying, like, it's not a zero-sum game, right? We want to share these stories because, one, these are great stories to share. And, just like a stockholder wants to diversify their portfolio because, well, you just want to make sure you have the greatest, broadest, options to benefit from. And it's the same thing with our stories, right? The more diverse the stories, the broader appeal it has to everyone. Like, what's the old saying? The more specific a story, the more universal it actually is,
Yeah. I mean, I represented writers and directors and producers for many years. And then I went over the development side. There's no one that used that line more than in great specificity comes great relatability. Like there's so much opportunity when you are breaking new ground with story, right? Like, and I always say you have to expect the unexpected. You don't want to see the expected. We can't be chasing the last big thing. We got to go find the next big thing. And that's always been my philosophy when I'm developing content, with whether it be from the buying side or the selling side. But now I have this opportunity to kind of close the gap in between and help storytellers, again, support them in what is the story that you want to tell, no matter what your identity is. How can I help you tell that story in the way that it's going to reach the largest audience possible?
Are there any specific tools or programs that are coming up that we should know about that's part of this inclusive, I don't want to say initiative, but this kind of like systemic change that you're bringing to Warner Brothers?
Well, there's a number of things. I think it's what are the resources that we can offer writers, directors, producers, those people that are in leadership positions, if you will, on these productions, because I think most creatives come into this business with their dream and their Hollywood dream. I don't know, what your point of view on this, but when I came into this business, it's because I loved entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
I loved In Living Color. I loved SNL. I loved sitcoms. I grew up on that. My family learned the nuance of English through sitcoms, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the fact that my mom, got ripped out of India when, she was 17 and married off to, not ripped. Sorry. I get passionate about how much my mom has done.
Yeah.
Despite, right.
And we'll get to that. We'll talk about that in a minute.
I know, but I say that because, the nuance of the way we use English versus the rest of the world is so different. And when you can learn that, the fact that my mom has the command of comedy in the way that she does, even when she speaks, is like so cool to me. It's like, that's a hard thing to get as an immigrant.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. I was like, oh, well, if she can do that, I was like, well, we can all do anything.
Right.
That's the case, right?
100%.
Yeah.
Well, let's rewind a little bit and talk about how your family ended up in Pikeville, Kentucky.
Absolutely. There are some stereotypes that are true. My father is a physician. But my mom, I always call my mom, I was like, my mom kind of became a real estate tycoon in India after time because of I'm just kidding. She didn't really become a tycoon, but the things that she learned over time is so interesting to me. But back to my dad, he basically, much like the medical world at that time was, which is if you were an immigrant doctor, my father was educated in India. He came here via Ireland, spent a year there, 2 years, I think, doing a residency in England and Ireland. My brother was born there. They then came to New York, where they actually, had to do another residency and then moved to Chicopee, Massachusetts, where I was born, and Basketball Hall of Fame in Springfield, Massachusetts. I always say that it's the reason why I became somewhat of a decent basketball player, because I was born there.
It's just in your genes, yeah.
Yeah, I was like, it's in my genes. But basically, he, after doing the number of residencies and fellowships and all the things that you have to do when you come here as an immigrant, one of the first jobs he got was in Williamson, West Virginia. He got an opportunity there. And so one of our first stops after I was born, which is 2 weeks after I was born, we went to Whitesburg, Kentucky, where there was another Indian family that happened to speak the same language as us, that through the Asian Indian network,
right.
we were able to connect with and have some comfort food and say, like, it's okay, like, you'll figure it out. The found family is, I think, like one of the most incredible stories that never gets told, is how much found family that you have when you immigrate here, and this community that you have to build on your own for even the smallest monicum of comfort.
Mm-hmm.
But my dad essentially took the first job he got here and was, I think, not enamored by the hospital system and the medical system in Eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, and was like, I'm going to go out on my own. And that was at the time when the incredible people before us that fought for many civil rights here, there was a lot of opportunities available for people of color in, Kentucky, West Virginia, specifically Appalachia.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad decided to bring more technology to Eastern Kentucky. So he, instead of looking at the machines that were there, he was like, oh, let me go and find something that's a little more tech forward and invest in that so that we can bring more technology to. And I don't know, my dad's a radiologist. So when you think about the opportunity there in terms of all the coal mines and everything to do preventative care, which, even now to this day, it's hard to get preventative care for people. And you think that is a system that is really continuing to change. And now that we've been through the pandemic, we're seeing it all over again, right? This is where the inequities lie. So if anything, if people aren't going to listen to the entertainment industry, they should listen to the medical industry.
Yeah. I mean, to your point earlier, like these inequities are kind of built in every system. I mean, that's why it's called systemic, right? It's in every system that we have in this country. So how old were you when you kind of settled in Kentucky? Because you said you were born in Boston or born in Springfield, and then like you were 2 weeks old and moving to West Virginia,
I'm fully informed. My entire life and memories are informed by Williamson, West Virginia, and the King Cole Festival, and Pikeville, Kentucky, which is the home of Hillbilly Days, which is our big festival. So most of my youth, my education, all of that stuff is informed by like the great people of those towns. And I think specifically we moved to Pikeville 10 years after, like when I was around 10 for better schools. And I think you probably are aware of how that often happens is
right.
Your parents come to this country, education is all they care about, and stability is all they care about. And, they came here for education. And so we go to the school, and it's an independent school. Which is essentially our public school in Pikeville. And that was the first time where I was like, oh, people are very encouraging. And, at home, it's like, where's the other 3 points? Instead, right. And so I had these two dynamics with like all of this encouragement and then all of this, like, you have to do really well at everything you do, essentially.
Yeah, the stereotypical hard-ass Asian parents, right?
Yeah. And like, I always say this, which is like the difference between being actively discouraged, encouraged, or nobody saying anything at all. Right. Is that sometimes if nobody says anything at all, you can choose your path and figure it out. But when you're actively discouraged, which I feel like a lot of the Asian community feels that when they're going down atypical path that maybe the generation before them didn't, go down, or places that feel more mystery because they just don't know, right?
Because to your point, like the reason they come here is for stability. And if you decide, hey, mom, I'm going to be an actor, it's like, well, where's the stability in that? So why did we come here and give you this life if you're just going to go off and like live paycheck to paycheck? And I think that's where a lot of that, tiger parenting comes from, I think.
And it's the resilience of that. And I think, but I think anybody can relate to the resilience of, you're down and out, or you're down and out with an education is very different.
Right.
And it's, I think, and I'm not saying that anybody was down and out. I'm just saying that it's just different.
Yeah.
You're like hyper focused on this one thing, whether you have $0 or more dollars, at least you have this one thing to push you in one direction or the other.
Yeah, 100%. So growing up in Pikeville, like, I mean, you said Hillbilly Days is your renowned festival. What? I'm assuming it's quite rural.
It's actually going on right now.
Oh, is it? Are we in the middle of Hillbilly Days? That's awesome.
Hillbilly Days.
So I'm assuming then it's quite rural because it's not like there's a lot of cosmopolitan areas throughout.
Pikeville was the cosmopolitan area, just so you know. It was a town of 5,600 people, and at one point it was actually rated like in the top 100 small towns in the country. At one point, but and it has one of the biggest land moving projects outside of at one point biggest land moving project outside of the Panama Canal.
Oh, and what is that?
It's called the Cut Through. You can go look it up.
It was like they're just cutting a hole through a mountain or something.
It's exactly right. It's just called the Cut Through. I used to tennis practice was up there. The conditioning, all of that stuff.
Nice.
They end up putting a park up there in a YMCA. It's very interesting.
Sounds cool. Well, but it's the point I was trying to get to, because I grew up, you mentioned I grew up in Virginia, and I grew up, and I talk about this in the pod all the time. Like, I grew up in a very small town, and you talk about like these stories, and for Asian Americans in particular, I think a story that's rarely told, and the reason I started this podcast is that like idea of being Asian American in a small rural town in the South. I think that's like until Minari a couple years ago, like you didn't even think when I told people I did a podcast about being Asian American and Southern, they'd be like, I didn't know they existed. I thought all Asians were like on the coasts. So like talk specifically about what was your experience as an Indian girl growing up in Kentucky? Like, did you ever feel like that, like, because here's the thing, the dirty secret I have, right? Like, I never felt out of place. You know what I'm saying? Like, I was actually like, I always felt like one of the guys. And it wasn't until I moved to a more diverse area, like I told you, I moved to Virginia Beach, where I started to feel like othered and different, even though there were more Asians, more people of color around. Like where I grew up, I was the only Asian family. There were very few black people, but I'd never felt racism from anyone, black people, white people, anything. I mean, looking back, maybe there were some instances, but it just kind of like rolled off your back, right? I come to like a more quote unquote diverse part of the world. And that's when I started really understanding what it means to be othered. I say all that to ask, like, what was your experience in Kentucky?
I will say, take your kids to a small town because that's the only way to keep any version of utopia. I'm kidding. But I have such fond memories of there, and it's only in hindsight, and especially now when everybody's talking about microaggressions and everybody's talking about, people have the words to really kind of connect things. It's some of it's like you don't realize because nature versus nurture. And when you're fighting these two identities, or you're accepting both of these identity and living two lives, when you're at home versus outside of the house, what are you telling your parents versus what are you living?
Right.
I did a movie a long time ago, which really resonated with me. And the reason why I got involved with it was Meet the Patels.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah. Which is the idea of like lying to your parents, right? And the romantic comedy is not actually between him and the girl. It's between him and the parents, right?
Yeah.
And I think that living your truth and living your 100% authentic self that we get to talk about today, what was that for us?
Right.
Like, I didn't know what my 100% authentic self was. It was so mixed in terms of like, I would come home from, school and tell my parents, I was like, oh, I can't really go spend the night at my friend's house unless I go to Sunday school on Sunday morning with them. And I don't want to be the bad guy the bad person of like saying, you know what, I don't really want to go to Sunday school. I'm not Christian. And I'm not like, I'm Hindu, like born Hindu. My parents aren't super religious,
right.
We're spiritual in the sense like, do good things to people, good things will happen hopefully to you. Like, give back, like
right.
Simple things that you can live your life by. And I found like, that was the identity that I was like constantly struggling with, and people being like, you should bring Jesus into your life because that's going to be better for you. And I was like, I'm so confused right now.
I think like that's a
little light of mine. Like it's,
right. I mean, that's definitely an experience that I think a lot of folks who grew up in like enclaves in like Brooklyn don't really understand. Like, because I've told this story before where we had this thing called Kinney Bible, where like this little van would pull up to the elementary school like every 2 weeks. And it was quite progressive for the 80s. Like you had to like sign a waiver. Your parents had to sign a waiver to let you go attend the Kinney Bible class. And my dad would say like, go ahead. We're not Christian, but you should learn about it.
That's what the openness of my parents.
Yeah.
There was no hate towards it. They're like, go if you want.
Right.
And by the way, sometimes that was the only way that, if that's the culture that you brought your children into, you assimilate and you figure out how to make it work.
Right. And you assimilate without losing who you are. Because I think sometimes, especially now, like to your point, like we have the words for it. And I think the notion of assimilation does have a negative connotation now because it's almost like losing who you are. But I think the way your parents, the way my parents and our families kind of looked at it was like, at no point did we ever like deny who we were. Like we were always who we were, but we also like went along to get along too.
Yeah.
Being kind to one another, being respectful of one another is what we were like raised to be. And that's probably why I think a lot of times like some of those things where I look back and like, oh yeah, that was totally a microaggression, but at the time it just kind of rolled off your back. And anything that was more serious than that, I don't either I repress it or I don't remember it.
Yeah.
And it's because like, yeah, it's those type of things did not just like wreck your whole day just because they happen.
Yeah, totally. But it's also people making assumptions. It's people not asking questions, right? It's just like, that's usually where this comes from. And it's interesting that you were saying like the aggression part of it and all of that. I also like when we think about social media and the cancel culture of it all, and it's like, stop Asian hate or stop the hate. I'm like, how about be kind? How about just be curious?
We tried be best, but that didn't work out too well.
I love that people are celebrating excellence and sometimes putting a I think sometimes they put race on the excellence. I'm just like, how about we all just be excellent?
Just be excellent.
Like,
yeah.
I was like, excellence isn't a race.
In the immortal words of Keanu Reeves and Bill and Ted, like, be excellent, right?
I mean, I'm just going to go ahead and let you know, I live my life by Bill and Ted.
So there you go. Excellent. Excellent. Again, there's something to be said about that kind of like small town experience. That's again a unique thing in the pantheon of like Asian American stories. There aren't any, to my knowledge, really, that explore those worlds. And we talk about diversity, like, I'm glad that in the last like 4 or 5 years, you know, thanks to Warner Brothers with Crazy Rich Asians, it kind of opened the floodgates to like more Asian American stories over the last few years. But like, I want to see more stories that kind of reflect your experience and my experience, right? Like, what does it mean to be an Asian American kid growing up in a rural coal mining town? Like,
if someone would just come in and pitch me Love and Basketball meets Mississippi Masala,
there you go.
I have no green light power. That being said, I would champion the best version of that any day.
I love that. I love that. I mean, the pitch itself. I mean, someone please put that on tomorrow.
Yeah.
So one last thing I wanted to ask about. I do this segment. This is the one recurring segment that we have on the show. And it's because being Asian and being Southern, you would think there aren't a lot of overlaps. But as we've discussed for the last 30 minutes, there's plenty of overlap being both Southern and being Asian.
Fried food?
But the biggest overlap is the love of food in general, right? So is there a particular dish that always brings you back, no matter where you are? You're in the middle of a meeting, you're pushing, you know, forward in the world of Hollywood, but this memory or this smell comes up in your brain and it instantly travels you back to Pikeville, Kentucky. What would that dish be?
Chicken and dumplings and mashed potatoes.
Simple as that.
I mean, it is. I mean,
can you get good chicken and dumplings in LA?
Hell no. unless I, you know what, I'll reserve the right to be told differently, but I love food and I travel all around the city trying to find the best and the yummiest, and I've yet to find that specific dish. The other thing I just absolutely am obsessed with is just fried food generally. But there's one thing in particular that is not specific to Pikeville, Kentucky or anything like that, but the candy, that the homemade candies that I grew up on, when it's like, they call them Buckeyes if you're in Ohio, but
okay,
it's peanut butter balls.
Oh,
And
right.
there is a woman in my hometown that makes them with Rice Krispie treats on the inside.
Nice.
And that to me is home. That and peanut butter fudge. Lemon icebox pie. You put those.
So you got a bit of a sweet tooth, is what you're saying, is what you're revealing here.
Specific, very specific to peanut butter and chocolate. There's not a. We're in the drought right now for Reese's cups, and because you know I love holiday Reese's cups. We're in the drought right now because we got to wait till that next holiday, which isn't like till October.
Oh, I see. You can't just get regular Reese's cups.
That
doesn't cut it.
I can. They're really good, but it's just not the same as the ratio.
Yeah. Absolutely. Has anyone ever deep fried a peanut butter ball though? Is that you know how they like deep fry Oreos and deep fry Snickers bars? Like
well, Keith, I don't know how Hillbilly Days has evolved, but maybe next year we meet there and
I would find out. I would love that. Let's hope whatever variant of Omicron has been completely eradicated by then, and we can definitely check out a Hillbilly. You know, I would love to turn this podcast into like a travel food show where I just go around and like eat Asian American Southern food.
Well, let me talk to somebody.
I was going to say like Discovery. That's right up Discovery's alley, isn't it? So
let's just send in this podcast. Let's see what they say. I have some friends.
I could talk to you for hours on end because I think this is just utterly fascinating what you're doing and totally necessary. Can you tell our listeners what is the best way to get involved or find out more about you, yourself, and your inclusive mission at Warner Brothers?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn. I have really, really fought social media over the course of my lifetime because
Good for you.
Well, it's very, very hard for me because I'm not one of those people that wants everything out there all the time. And I don't know, it feels, just even seeing kids going through it, I'm like, I feel like I'm going through,
Yeah.
but I am on LinkedIn and I'm on there and I try to post better content, especially and things that I'm just really enjoying and trailblazers that are out there and talent to watch. That's what I really care about. And I talk a lot about the nonprofit work that I do because I'm so passionate about that and have been for a very long time. And I just joined the board of Scholarship America. So that's something that's really exciting to me. So you'll probably see a lot of that. But if you want the exciting stuff, you just got to see me in person.
Yeah, there you go. And we'll have links out to Warner's inclusive site and social media handles in our description. Samata, thank you so much for being on Southern Fried Asian. I wanted to spend some more time and talk to you about like basketball, because I feel like there's like a little basketball junkie inside of you that's just like roaring to get out. And we're deep in the playoffs junkie right now, so.
Well, my Clippers. I'll send you a picture of one of my favorite pair of shoes. You'll be very jealous.
Oh no! Okay, great. I love Jordans, so if they're related.
Get ready!
All right, I'm excited.
You're gonna be so jealous of these.
I already am. Well, Samantha, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I can't wait to see more of what you're doing at Warner and talk to you in the future and see you at Hillbilly Days next year.
Let's do it. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure and such an honor to even be considered. So thanks.
Oh no, the pleasure is mine. You can follow me on Twitter at @TheRealChow, _real_Chow, and on Instagram at RealKeithChow. Follow the podcast at Southern Fried Asians on Instagram and at Southern Asians on Twitter. Subscribe and download on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, anywhere you get podcasts. Find it all at hardknockmedia.com/Southern Fried Asian. As always, the podcast has been co-produced by Jess Vu. And until next time, keep it Southern Fried, y'all.